We'll get a convertible, the director said. And then the sun will shine in your face and we won't need lights. In Scotland in March? I don't think so. Anyway, are you one of those people who never lifts the bonnet on your car because you're frightened of what goes inside? Come with me, why don't you, on a journey of discovery while I explain what a simple thing it is. The internal combustion engine. So called because there is combustion and explosion internally. This 1 litre engine, when turned, will suck 1 litre of air and fuel into its cylinders. But what if you blew 2 litres of mixture into it? Why then, it would be supercharged. Any questions? "70 years ago, supercharging an engine became firstly a matter of national pride and then ultimately of life and you-know-what. And I've no wish to stir up old memories, but frankly, this is a tale about us and the other chaps."
Certainly you have to know, in principle, the characteristics of your enemy.
Well, of course, the Rolls-Royce Supercharger is far superior.
You could drive with any size of engine, with any type of car as you want.
The problem was keeping the tyres on.
The two countries whose national pride was at stake back in those halcyon days were Britain and, yes, you've guessed it, the Germans. When they met in the British Grand Prix in Brooklands in 1927, frankly, our chaps wiped the floor with Johnny Foreigner. Henry Tim Birkin outstripped the field in a car that was not only a superb bit of engineering, but also a symbol of Britain's national pride and confidence. Isn't she beautiful? The 1927 4.5 litre Bentley. Tim Birkin took one of these around here at Brooklands in 1927 and won. And then he went on to Le Mans and hammered the lap record. Not a bad year for the Brits, really. So old Timmy Birkin could have been forgiven for feeling rather cocky in 1928 until a few months later when he came here to Nürburgring for the German Grand Prix, when he encountered these beasties. And then I suspect he probably wished he was wearing brown overalls.
And there goes Stump, and there goes Ficklefinger, and there goes another German whose name escapes me. And there's Tim Birkin in his Bentley 4.5 litre, finishing in 8th position. He'll not be happy today. So, Mercedes first, second and third in the 1929 German Grand Prix. Bad luck, chap. Better luck next year.
So, what was it that Timmy saw in the woodshed that so frightened him? Was it the sharp corners and the big nasty cars? No, he was well used to that. What gave him the fright of his life was the device at the front of this engine here. It's capable of boosting the output of these engines by almost 50%. And it's called a supercharger. So, now I've won the Jessie hat competition. Boys, let's start our engines. Okay, let's go. Let's go, let's go. Yeah! How do you actually engage the supercharger then?
The supercharger is engaged by pressing the throttle full down on the floor.
Yes.
The effect is the same like a modern automatic car, like a kick down. You feel it now.
Old Tim didn't know what hit him, but as soon as he found out, he swore he'd never race again without one. This is Axel, and this is Axel's car, which is why I call him Very Lucky Axel. Could you show us the supercharger and what's going on here? Clip this one, shall I? Fantastic. So these are carburetors, like a normal engine, but what is surprising, of course, is this, isn't it?
Yes. This here is a supercharger, and the supercharger is mounted vertically in front of the crankshaft. and is running 3 times engine speeds. And the supercharger gives the pressure to the carburetors, and then the mixture is flowing inside the engine. And that fantastic noise is made in the carburetors by the pressed air. As soon as you're lifting your foot up from the pedal, there is a clutch stop too, which stops the supercharger immediately. The idea behind it was to use a supercharger only temporarily.
Yes.
And so Ferdinand Porsche constructed it as it is here.
Ferdinand Porsche. I wonder what came of him. This must have been one of his first big jobs, was it?
Yes.
Yeah, he must have been a young Turk in those days.
Of course, in fairness, the Germans did have a few advantages. Their engines were 2 litres larger, and successive governments massively funded research into engine design. The Daimler-Benz team had unlimited technical and financial backing. They weren't only racing for national pride either. The German government was offering very large sums of money indeed to German racing teams who pulled off a Grand Prix win. I mean, it's hardly cricket. In Britain, if you improve the performance of your engine more than a certain amount, the government put up your road tax. Nevertheless, as soon as they got back to Blighty, our chaps started fiddling with the idea of a supercharger of their own.
And you're the best man to explain this to us because you were part of the design team, weren't you?
Well, this is a supercar, of course. Supercharged 4.5, a Le Mans car. Marvellous.
Rivers used to drive a bit. Here he is hill climbing in the 50s.
That takes me back a long time, of course.
Does it?
That's what we used to call the blower, a supercharged, Amherst Villiers supercharger. So we didn't really want to have supercharged Bentleys. They weren't a commercial proposition. Every time this was discussed with W.O. Bentley, obviously he hated it.
Yes,
I mean, these designers, you know, they're brilliant people. They want their own design. And the idea of someone else's supercharger on his unsupercharged car, anyway, Tim Birkin had to have superchargers, and we built them. All the cars at Le Mans had to be production cars. So we had to build 50 to make 2 or 3, actually, for Le Mans.
The Bentley's externally mounted supercharger takes its inspiration from a very ancient Egyptian device.
Has he gone raving mad, are you asking yourselves? What is he doing now? Well, there's a principle involved here. It was the Egyptians who first noticed that a fire burns much quicker and much hotter when there's a bit of a breeze. And they invented a sort of bellows system for melting down very nice bits of bronze. And that's really the principle involved in the supercharger. Everything has to have oxygen to burn, and the more oxygen there is, the quicker it burns, and the more of whatever it is you're burning, you can burn. So basically, that's just a very posh set of bellows. So it's sook sook, blow blow, whiz whiz, wallop. It must have been a very expensive engineering project for one person to finance. Where did he find the money then, old Birkin?
Oh, well, of course, he was a very wealthy man, very spoiled, always spoiled, partly because he had terrific charm, particularly with the ladies.
Yeah, I know the type.
So Tim had a wonderful girlfriend, the Honourable Dorothy Paget, a very wealthy girl, spending a lot of money on expensive horses, and she wanted to please Tim Birkin, and Tim Birkin said, look, can I have superchargers for my Bentleys? And she said, yes, I'll pay for them.
Well, good old Dotty is all I can say.
Oh, yes, yes, wonderful.
Well, in spite of the fact that Lady Dorothy had given Tim a blower, he never came first. The difference that gave the Germans the edge was in the engineering of the supercharger. The subtlety of the Mercedes meant that it only kicked in when full power was needed. The Bentley's blower, however, was permanently engaged and therefore prone to overheating and mechanical failure. You could spend half the race in the pits. But as they say, when the going gets tough, the toughs get going.
But Tim Birkin, with a blower car, drove so hard and so fast that all the Mercedes had to keep up. They thought, we can't be beaten by this. And of course, they blew up.
In fact, both the supercharged Mercedes and Bentleys expired under pressure, and so the winner was an unsupercharged Bentley, one that had been steadily doing the laps.
But there had been 5 Bentleys racing against only 1 Mercedes.
That was the kind of odds they needed, poor souls.
Still, there's no need to sound quite so arrogant about it. After all, the odds were heavily stacked in the Germans' favour, what with all the government spondulics freely available.
It makes an interesting comparison with Bentley, whereas the Bentley supercharging effort was basically an upper-class nut of the few bob and a bright idea. The Mercedes development was backed by an enormous company, which in turn was backed by a fairly determined government, shall we say. And as the 30s progressed and the supercharger progressed, it's interesting because, of course, Germany was not, in those days, allowed to develop armaments. So one does wonder if the supercharger wasn't perhaps getting nearer and nearer being the perfect tool for the Superman.
As the 30s drew to a close, it became clear that the Germans had ambitions to use the supercharger for the domination of more than just the Grand Prix circuits of Europe.
Well, Britain might have been getting a bit of a slapping on the ground, but at least we felt secure in the air.
The Grand Prix of the Air, the Schneider Trophy, was won 3 times in succession by British planes in the 30s.
Seaplanes streaking at 340 miles an hour indicated the enormous strides taken by aviation since the last war and its likely importance in the next. By a merciful providence, the new models developed from the Schneider Trophy seaplanes were just coming into production when the present World War began.
Of course, there is a world of difference between flying as fast as you can in a figure-8 at low altitude and engaging in an aerial dogfight, especially with the Messerschmitt 109. With its supercharged Daimler-Benz engine producing 2,000 horsepower and flown by ace pilots, men like Günter Rahl, who shot down 285 Allied planes, early encounters with the Me-109 were often literally devastating to the RAF.
You know, when you fly this airplane for 5.5 years, you feel at home under all conditions. Certainly at the beginning of the war, flying this plane the first time in combat, it's very thrilling. The outcome of the first engagement is very important for the pilot. It gives you trust, self-confidence, and in my case also warning, because I got a lot of hits. In spite, I got my first victory.
Did you have a lot of confidence in the engine? Did you think it was a great engine when you first flew this?
Yes. The engine gave us enough power, and we felt at the beginning superior. When I was chased by Spitfires, I tried to escape by pushing stick forward full power.
Yeah.
And go.
Right.
You know? And it worked, you see.
Yes. So it would seem that all that money spent on the Daimler-Benz supercharger hadn't been in vain then.
Well, of course, the Rolls-Royce supercharger is far superior.
Was it?
But remember that we had to fight a war with an engine which was smaller than the engines in the competing aircraft, the Messerschmitt 109. So we had to boost the engine to higher pressures to make up for its smaller capacity.
The supercharged Merlin engine in the Mark 9 Spitfire is what they came up with. In many ways, the supercharger in the Spitfire was a lot like the old Bentley and the blower. Constantly engaged, prone to overheating, mechanically it was much simpler than the Daimler-Benz, but at least it now came with 2 speeds.
The Spitfire was easier to handle, far easier to handle.
Yeah.
But in many ways, the Messerschmitt was faster in climbing, faster in diving,
Yes.
getting away, and catching up again, you know.
Well, it's a perfectly ordinary, calm day in suburbia, and while some people are cutting their lawns and digging in the vegetables, Siggy here is working on his Messerschmitt engines. What could be more natural? Can you explain to people why there was a need for a supercharger?
Because if you are way up in the air, high up, you have less air pressure.
Yes.
And the engine loses performance.
Right.
So now, in order to have its maximum power available also at high altitudes, you have to artificially compress the air.
Compress the air, yes. Yes.
So you have to provide air pressure by the supercharger.
As usual, the Germans went for a more complicated design. The Messerschmitt supercharger was governed by variable air pressure, giving the 109 the opportunity for maximum power at any altitude.
The variable part is inside of this clutch. This piece here. See?
Yes.
And you see the ribs on it?
Yes.
The more oil pressure pumped into this, the less slippage you have.
Yes.
And the more RPM comes out of the impeller.
Engineering or what? The Germans claim that theirs was superior because it's variable speed and disengages at low revs.
Well, I think that the variable speed idea was very, very good indeed.
Yeah.
No question about that. Really. We looked into it,
Yes.
and we decided that a mechanical blower, 2 speeds and 2 stage is what we had to go to. The blower pressure is kept constant up to as far as it will go with 1 gear. And then as soon as you go above that altitude at which you reach the maximum for that gear, you change gear to a higher ratio.
Now, another positive feature on this engine is direct fuel injection. Used in a Messerschmitt, the pilot could go into a very steep dive because it supplied the correct mixture in every stage of its flight.
Yes.
Even on its back, since it used direct fuel injection,
Yes.
you had no cough, no nothing.
First of all, we admired the principle of fuel injection because we had carburetors on the Merlin, and one of the weaknesses of that particular system was that when the aircraft dived, the engine cut out due to negative G. The fuel was thrown up to the top of the float chamber and the engine cut out.
Yes.
This was a bit of a panic at the time.
I would think
And we
so.
had to
Ever
overcome
so
that
slightly.
problem.
Yes.
Yes. But there's another factor which you may not know about. The evaporation of the fuel drops the temperature by 25 degrees. That raises the pressure ratio of the compressor, or the blower,
Yes.
to your advantage. So you get that gain with a
Yes.
carburetor system that you don't have with the injection system.
Mechanical considerations aside, in my mind, the Spitfire is almost perfect to the eye. Whereas...
Is this a better plane than the Spitfire?
I think the Spitfire was a very good airplane, no doubt. And the Spitfire had some goodies over the 109. For instance, I flew it. They had a beautiful wing.
Yes.
The Spitfire, beautiful wing. We felt that this is a very, very adequate opponent.
Was there an ideal position to get a Spitfire in if you wanted to get it? You know, I mean, what was it? Do you come from underneath? You come from above? You come... None. You just whatever you could get.
You don't have always the favor to select your position. You know, you are in, and you have to see how to come out.
If I said, I am Father Christmas, Iggy, I can get you any bit of machinery you want, what would you get?
That would be definitely a 109. And maybe one of these days I will even fly one.
So the next question has to be, how did you come by these engines, Siggy?
Oh, that's a very big story. Most of these engines are crashes.
We got engaged with 2 Russians, and I turned in and got one, and he caught fire. And in this very moment, his wingman came behind me and shut off my engine.
Some of these have been in the ground down to 8 meters deep for 50 years.
The engine was just windmilling, couldn't do anything more.
Yeah.
And I tried to get it down because we're over Russian territory.
This one has been in a lake in Russia.
I bellied in at a too high speed.
These have been in a swamp, and you see the steel is very well preserved.
Yeah.
The last thing I saw was this wall come against me, and from there on, I couldn't remember anything.
It's quite a bit of damage. You see, the aluminium has kept good, but the steel has a lot of corrosion.
Yeah.
I broke my back three times and was a little bit paralyzed.
It's always really depressing when you think that all this fantastic technical advances really came, you know, so we could kill each other more efficiently. That's what always depresses me. Mind you, all the knowledge that was accrued during that business, it really did improve engine design for years afterwards, didn't it?
Yes.
Well, now that we've cleared the air and mentioned the war, I mean, the great thing about these in a way is it's just a bloody huge hairdryer. I mean, at the end of the day, it is. I mean, for all its complexity in metering and so on, at the end of the day, it's just a big blower, isn't it?
But this at 22,000 RPM used as a hairdryer, you look like me later on.
That's what did it. I suppose the Supercharger really belongs to that bygone age, when the measure of a man's worth was judged by his capacity for devil-may-care recklessness or unselfish heroism. At least, that's what I thought until now.
But then 60 years later, we find a production car that has as standard a Supercharger. And I wonder if you can guess who made it.
Let me give you a hint. It's meticulously engineered, its supercharger is variable, and it's German. And of course, it comes from a line of supercharged engineering that goes back nearly 70 years. Still, don't you worry, mate. I expect there's a couple of blokes in a shed in Solihull or somewhere trying to wallop a supercharger onto a Mondeo. Don't get too confident, Germany.
Robbie pays homage to the V8 next week. The book from the series will be available from ABC shops in March. Tonight, Four Corners returns for 98 with a special exposé by Sally Neighbour. That's coming up next.